Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to the Hilltop. Thank you for coming to SMU, the Center for Presidential History, in conjunction with the McGuire Center for Ethics. We are here tonight to do something that they said can't be done, and they might be right, which is have a conversation about the difficult issues facing America, in this case, the critical election we have coming up, and to demonstrate that we can do it while being informative and yet also civil and polite and respectful. And most importantly, remembering that what unites us as Americans is infinitely more than what divides us. So I want to thank in advance my two speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules, and they are really busy schedules, to come here and give us their words of wisdom. But I also want to make sure that there's a little bit of additional opportunity for everyone here to get their voice heard, if you will. You'll notice that there are note cards on your seats when you sat down. If you have a question, make it a question, not a comment. If you have a question that you'd like the speakers to address, please take a moment and fill out your note card and pass it to the end of one of the aisles, and that person hold it out. And our fellows will come by and pick it up, and they will hand those to me while on stage. So if you want your question asked, please, card, hand, take. Very easy. So, a little bit of context. I know that most of you, as you think about this election coming up in just about a month, have been, like me, continuously thinking, my God, this is nothing like the election of 1912. For the obvious reason that in the election of 1912, all three candidates, yes, there were three, actually there was four if you include the socialist Eugene Debs, all three candidates, major candidates, had the same platform. In fact, the New York Times lamented that it's just a shame that there's more than Tweedledee and Tweedledum, because there's not a dime's worth of difference between any of them. Now, I would argue there was a significant difference on a lot of issues between Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and William Howard Taft, but to be honest, nothing I think like the comparison that we're seeing today. I am hard-pressed as a historian to go back and look at the elections that we have had in our country's history and see two candidates with such divergent worldviews, with such divergent assessments of where the United States is and where the United States is going, which leads to a very uncomfortable conclusion that the thing that they always tell us may actually be true. The thing that they always tell us every single election cycle, whether it's for the president, city council, or dog catcher, is that this is the most important election of your lifetime. Every now and then it's true. And therefore, I'm really glad that we have such thoughtful people to come today to give us their words of wisdom on how we should understand, again, in a positive and civil manner, how we should understand the domestic policies of former President Biden and of Vice President Harris. A reminder, of course, that in 1 month's time, we'll run this experiment again, looking at the foreign policies of each of the candidates. So mark your calendars for that already, and you can actually write out your card ahead of time for that one, if you want. So let me introduce our speakers in reverse order. They're going to give about 10 minutes, each of them, basically laying out their perspective on what they think is most important about their particular candidate's domestic policies. Then I'll have a few moments of questioning and discussion with them, and then we'll turn to your cards. So again, please hold out your cards. Maxine, hold it really high. There you go. Okay. So our speakers, the first is, second actually, is going to be Professor Peniel Joseph, who is a professor of public affairs and the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values, and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. Let me interject to say two things before I go further. The first is I'm giving very abbreviated bios here, because if I gave the entire bio for each of these people, that'd be the entire show. Secondly, I want to stress one thing about my friend Peniel. He really annoys me. Because we are exactly the same age and he has a lot more books than I do. Including, he just told me today, not one, but two coming out in the fall. Next year. Yeah, so next Christmas. You'll be able to get them, though I'm sure they'll be there much before Christmas. I think one on Malcolm X, and the second was on 1963. Nothing happened, so it's a very short book. I would go into detail on all of his books, but let me just say that he is one of the leading thinkers and leading speakers and leading historians of American politics, of American race relations, and of American values, and we're thrilled to have him here. Presenting the Trump side of the story, if you will, is Stephen Moore, who is an economic advisor to the Trump campaign and co-author with Dr. Arthur Laffer of a new book which is out just this week. Just this week? Man, we timed that puppy. The Trump Economic Miracle. Steve is a renowned economist, author, and policy analyst with more than 3 decades of experience in economic policy and also the media. He has worked on numerous projects, including the aforementioned Trump Economic Miracle, and also Trumponomics, Inside the America First Plan to Revive Our Economy. If you wouldn't mind giving a big welcome to Steve, who, by the way, just let me interject, we've decided that he's going to go first because his candidate was officially nominated first. I thought that was pretty good. So, all right, without further ado, please welcome Stephen Moore.
Well, hello, folks. So a little something about me. I grew up in a middle-class household. I worked at McDonald's. That's a joke, of course. Appreciate you having me. I like to take the temperature of the room, if I may. How many of you in this room have a positive opinion of Trump? Raise your hand. Maybe a third of you. How many of you have a negative opinion of Trump? How many of you actually like Trump, but you're just embarrassed to admit it? By the way, I knew that Trump was going to win in 2016 when I saw bumper stickers a few weeks before the election that said, "Vote for Donald Trump. Nobody has to know." And that there are hidden Trump voters out there. Professor, great to be with you, and it's an honor to be with you here on the great campus of SMU. We're talking about domestic policy here. I'm not an expert at all on foreign policy, and I'm not an expert on social policy either. I believe that if this election, as I hope it is about the economy and who is better to make sure that on the kitchen table issues, the pocketbook issues, who's better for America, then Trump will win the election. I mean, there's really no doubt about that. Trump clearly, this is one of the most important, this may be the first time ever, you're the historian, you may know, but we essentially have 2 incumbents running. We have Donald Trump, who had 4 years in office, and we've had Joe Biden / Kamala Harris, who've had 3 3/4 years in office. So what I did in my book was something pretty simple. I just said, okay, let's look at the record of these 2 administrations on the economy. Now, look, I think if the election is about abortion, Trump will lose because the country has become more pro-choice. If the election is about what happened on January 6th, Trump will lose. If it's about Trump talking about, the election was stolen and things like that, he will lose. But if it is about these pocketbook issues, it's really a pretty clear cut. And the polls show pretty clearly that most Americans agree with me that Trump is far superior in terms of his handling the economy than Biden and Harris were. So I think there's 3 issues. When I talked to Trump, I just got together with him about 2 weeks ago. I said, Mr. President, just remember, this election is always and everywhere about the 3 I's. The 3 I's. So what are the 3 I's? I'm sure you can all imagine what those are. Number 1, immigration. Clearly, that is foremost on most Americans' minds. The deterioration. By the way, I am very pro-immigration. Trump is very pro-immigration. We have put together a plan in 2019 that was more visas, more work visas, more of the visas for the brainiacs. We need more immigrants in this country, but they have to come legally. And I think that's a strong consensus among the American people that we can't have 10 million illegal immigrants in the country. And unfortunately, that has eroded public support for a smart legal immigration system that actually expands the number of visas. I would double the visas. Now, I don't know if Trump would do that, but I think he would increase them. So immigration clearly is a big issue for Americans. We did secure the border under Trump, and obviously that hasn't happened under Biden. The second issue is inflation. Americans hate inflation. They hate inflation. I'm old enough to remember the first election I ever paid attention to was the 1980 election. Anybody old enough to remember the Carter versus Reagan? And that was a very famous election. By the way, I would say in my lifetime, the 1980 election was the most important election in our lifetime. It was so imperative that that we not re-elect Jimmy Carter, and that we elected one of our greatest presidents ever in Ronald Reagan. We won the Cold War without firing a shot. We rebuilt the American economy. We cut taxes. We did amazing things. And so when you compare these issues what I was going to say is Reagan very famously in the debate against Jimmy Carter said, "Are you better off 4 years ago than you were 4 years ago?" And it turned out about 70% of Americans said they weren't better off, and Reagan ended up winning a landslide. I think that's the point that Trump has to make over and over and over again. By the way, the answer to that question for most Americans, no. They say that in the polls. The polls are very clear. Most Americans say they're worse off today than they were 4 years ago. And one of the reasons they say they're worse off financially 4 years ago is because they are. They are. If you look at real incomes for average median income families, the average family has lost about $1,500 in purchasing power. That is to say, they're poorer today. Under Donald Trump, the average family gained about $6,000 in income. That's big. That's a huge increase in real. And by the way, that's after inflation income for the people right in the middle. And so that's the third issue. The I is incomes. Incomes. Are people better off or worse off? So, but there are other issues. We looked at a whole panoply of issues. We looked at small business conditions. With small businesses, how did they feel about the economy during the Biden administration? Not very good. How did they feel about Trump? Very good. We looked at things like mortgages. I know there are some young people in here. This is mostly an older audiences, but I see some students here. I have two sons that are in their early 30s. That's about the time you start looking at buying a house. You start looking at taking out a mortgage. Both of them are in that kind of stage of their life. They can't buy a house today. Are you kidding? They can't. They're just too expensive. And that's because mortgage rates, when Trump left office, were 3%. 3% mortgage rates. Remember that? Today, the mortgage rate is 6.5% to 7%. That means that if you want to buy a median value home across the country, you're going to pay your average mortgage payment on a 30-year mortgage is going to be twice as high today as it was when Trump was president. So the American dream of home ownership has drifted away from Americans because of higher interest rates. Inflation. Kamala Harris said the other day that inflation was a result of Trump policies. Wait a minute. Come on. Anybody know what the inflation rate was the month that Donald Trump left office? It was 1.4%. 1.4%. That's less than the target that the Fed sets for inflation. The Fed sets a 2% target. We were below that. In fact, during Trump's whole 4 years in the presidency, the average inflation rate was 1.9%. That's pretty darn good. Under Joe Biden and Kamala, the average inflation rate has been 6.5%. And one of the things that really bothers me is that when the administration came in, they took, somehow, I don't know how they did it, they took the inflation rate in 18 months from 1.5% to 9.1%. I mean, come on, how do you screw up an economy that quickly? You'd almost have to try to do that. And of course, that's just wrecked the finances of so many American families. There are a couple of other things that matter. I mean, the stock market has been good under Biden, but when you adjust for inflation, the stock market was better under Trump than Biden. You always have to look at the after-inflation effects of all these policies, not the before-inflation effects. When you look at policies like labor productivity was much higher under Trump than it's been under Biden. When you look at tax policy, we were very proud of and I'm proud of this because I helped design the tax cut. we reduced the highest corporate tax rate in the United States from 35 to 21%. Now, why did we do that? Did we do that because, oh, we loved American corporations and we love corporate America? No, we didn't do that. We did it because the U.S. corporate tax rate was up here. And I'll never forget my first meeting with Trump, exactly about 8.5 years ago. I showed him the chart. We were up here, the rest of the world was down here. So we were taxing our corporations, when you take state and local into effect, at like a 40% rate, and the rest of the world was at like 20%. Well, that's unpatriotic. I mean, how idiotic is that? As Trump looked at the chart, I'll never forget, he said, that's like putting a 20% tariff on everything made in America. We were like putting a tariff on ourselves. What country does that? When we remember these, there was something called, how many of you have heard of a term called inversions? Inversions were when U.S. companies would give up their UN citizenship and move to other countries, in Europe or Asia or Ireland and other countries. And why were they doing that? They were doing that to take advantage of the lower taxes in other nations. We lowered that tax rate to 20%. We caused a huge, huge amount of capital flow in the United States. And it caused this ferocious, ferocious expansion that we had. And I'll end on this last point, and then I'll turn it over to the professor. If it had not been for COVID, Trump would have won probably a 40-state re-election landslide. The economy was absolutely booming in January or February of 2020. In fact, I remember waking up in the middle of the night with a premonition, oh my God, everything is going so well, something is going to happen. I didn't know if it was going to be a meteor, I didn't know if it was going to be a tornado, or a hurricane, a terrorist attack. Who would have ever suspected it would be a virus? But that virus changed everything. And by the way, never, never, I think the one thing we can all agree on, I hope we've learned this lesson, never again should we allow the government to shut down our businesses, right? Never again. Never again should they be allowed to shut down our schools, our churches, our playgrounds. This was probably the greatest abuse of power by government in history. And I hope, can we all agree on that we should never allow government to do that again? No. So, because lockdowns killed about 10 times more people than they saved. And so that's where we are. I think the case is pretty overwhelming for Trump when it comes to the economy, but I'm really looking forward to hear what the professor has to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. All right, I'm going to say that again. Good evening. Yeah, I want to get people excited and engaged. A little bit about myself. My name's Peniel Joseph. I am the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to New York City in 1965. I grew up in Southside Jamaica, Queens, and Brooklyn. I'm also the proud son of a labor union family, right? So I grew up SEIU 1199. And I say that because all those things are things that have shaped not just myself and my family, but have shaped the American dream. So the case that I'm going to make in really just 10 minutes, I'm not going to get deep in terms of policy. We can talk about that in the questions and answers in our dialogue. But it's about bigger, broader themes of citizenship, dignity, and multiracial democracy. I'll say that again. Citizenship, dignity, and multiracial democracy. These are all the bedrocks of the American dream after the end of racial slavery in 1865. So there is a second American republic that is founded in the blood of over 700,000 Americans who fought in the Civil War to create that second American republic, a republic that stood on the foundations of citizenship and dignity for all people in a multiracial democracy. That multiracial democracy was halted by the rising tide of white supremacist fascism in the 19th century, right? That's how we euphemistically call it Jim Crow, but white supremacist fascism is how the Confederacy, and remember, Texas is the largest state in the Confederacy, loses the Civil War, but wins the peace confoundingly. And by winning the peace, they destroyed the dream of multiracial democracy, or so they thought. They merely delayed it until the second Reconstruction. We think about not just Martin Luther King Jr., but we think about Barbara Jordan and Diane Nash. We think about Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, right? We think about this second American Reconstruction that was centered on this idea, enduring idea of citizenship, dignity, and multiracial democracy for all. What we can't do when we think about the 2024 election is try to normalize 2017 to 2021. We can't normalize a 4-year period that wasn't about economic opportunity, that wasn't about citizenship and dignity for all, that wasn't about multiracial democracy, but instead was about Charlottesville. It was about tiki torches. It was about you will not replace us, and anti-Semitism and anti-black racism. It was about Islamophobia. It was about xenophobia. It was about calling the country that my mother's from, Haiti, and other African countries and Caribbean countries, shithole countries. It was about a person who eviscerated the honor and dignity of what it meant to be the commander-in-chief of the United States of America, right? Somebody who I'm not going to name, because the office is more important than a cult of personality around somebody who is undeserving to hold that office, somebody who doesn't hold our military veterans in honor, somebody who said that John McCain, who is one of the heroes of the 20th century as a military officer, was a loser for being a prisoner of war, right? So when we think about this idea of 2024, what are we fighting for? What is at stake? What is at stake is nothing less than the American ideal of citizenship, dignity, and multiracial democracy. I alluded to, for a second, the Civil War and Reconstruction. That's important because we've had 3 periods of Reconstruction since 1865 in the United States of America. The first period was 1865 to 1898, end of the Civil War until the white riot in Wilmington, North Carolina, that ended the last of the Reconstruction governments in the South. Then we had a second Reconstruction, really from around the Second World War all the way into the 1970s. We usually think about the heroic period of the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968 as being the centerpiece of that second Reconstruction. We're thinking about May 17th, 1954, the Brown Supreme Court desegregation decision. We're thinking about August 28th, 1955, and Emmett Till, a young 14-year-old black boy from Chicago, is lynched in Money, Mississippi. His body is found in the Tallahatchie River with a 125-pound cotton gin fan belt tied around his neck, and Emmett Till's mother allows his open casket funeral to be in the pages of Jet magazine, which is the African-American working class magazine by John Johnson. We think about Little Rock Central High School and Eisenhower sending in the 101st Airborne to escort those young children, and there's a white mob in Little Rock Central High School, a mob that Norman Rockwell and other people have eulogized because kids are trying to go to the school. Of course, we think about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and the 381-day bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. We think about the sit-in movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, February 1st, 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina, and 4 black college students from A&T sitting in at a lunch counter. By the end of that spring semester, there's over 60,000 students who sat in all across the United States. They were sitting in for dignity and citizenship. We think about John Lewis and others who are arrested as freedom riders in 1961, right? In May and June and July and all throughout that year, that forced the Kennedy administration to take a stand on the most pressing global issue of our time, which is always human rights. We call it civil rights here, but it's always human rights. Is everybody still with me? 1962, Oxford, Mississippi desegregates the University of Mississippi. 3 days of rioting that leaves 2 people dead when James Meredith becomes the first black student enrolled at the University of Mississippi. 1963 is the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's also one of the most pivotal years in American history, right? One of the most pivotal years in American history, because 1963 is the year where, before our George Floyd political and racial reckoning, we had the largest numbers of civil rights demonstrations in American history in 1963 that forced John F. Kennedy to do his famous civil rights address on June 11th, 1963, 8 p.m., where he says that civil rights is a moral issue. Those who do nothing invite shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly recognize right as well as reality. This is John F. Kennedy. 1963 is also when we have the March on Washington. And at that March on Washington, August 28, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. begins that I Have a Dream speech by saying, now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. In that speech, he says, we come to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of American Justice is bankrupt. That's what he says on August 28, 1963. That same year is where we see the 4 little girls who are killed by white supremacist terrorists in Birmingham, 1963, right? John F. Kennedy is killed right here in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963, and it's through the blood of those small children in Birmingham, the blood of Medgar Evers, the blood of John F. Kennedy, that we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed on July 2nd, 1964 by Lyndon Johnson, and the Voting Rights Act passed on August 6, 1965. And when we think about the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Brown decision, all those demonstrations, all those protests are what reconfigured American democracy to become multiracial for the first time. That's what gives us Barack Obama. And I would say that the most important election in my lifetime was 2008. The 2008 election. Because what the 2008 election did was bring us closer to that dream of multiracial democracy. Not just symbolically, but substantively, right? In 2008. And so when we think about this 2024 election, and I'll close, what we're really talking about is citizenship. How do we define it? Who's going to have access to it? I don't think anybody in this country is illegal. I think there are some people who are undocumented. The only reason we have birthright citizenship in the United States is because of the 14th Amendment and the Civil War. We all would not have citizenship here if not for what our ancestors did. So this idea that there are these illegal people here, these people we can otherize, there but for the grace of God go all of us, right? You still with me? Still with me? When we think about this idea of dignity, we are all born with human dignity. And that's what Kamala Harris has talked about, not just at the Democratic National Convention, but her economic policies and domestic policies. Human dignity is our birthright. Citizenship is the mere external institutional recognition of that human dignity. And so we have to understand that as Americans, our greatest gift globally has been extending this idea of human dignity to all at our best. Whether those folks are in Israel, in Palestine, in Haiti, in Africa, in Europe, in Ukraine, it's extending that idea of human dignity. Not closing the doors, not building walls. The United States of America at its best, and I'm thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, builds bridges and not walls, right? It invites people into this idea of a beloved community and does not say that we have all that we need and we want to exclude and turn everybody else into pariahs and demonize and dehumanize. We don't do that. So I'll close by saying this. Multiracial democracy, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that all of us historically who have been marginalized, people who are black, who are Jewish, who are women, who are Chinese, who are Asian, who are Hispanic, who are Native American and indigenous, we have a say and have access in this democracy on an equal moral and political footing. That's what multiracial democracy means. And the only person who's running for president who believes in multiracial democracy is the Vice President of the United States. So for all of us who think about democracy as our birthright, right? Citizenship as our inheritance, we have to understand our common denominator, the values that we share, are always centered around human dignity. And it's this notion of human dignity that should bound us all in a belief that we want a president to represent us, a president who is as good as the promise of America. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen. That was wonderful, enlightening and interesting. Please, I'll remind you once more, if you have a question, write it on your card, hold it up. We'll have somebody come by. Have they not picked up your card yet? Augusta, come on. Okay, I'm going to give you two the opportunity to ask each other something in a moment. But while you consider your question, I'm going to ask you something myself. And that is, how can each of your campaigns and each of your candidates, how can each of them bridge what I think is a critical divide in the United States today, which is the lack of a common fact base, the lack of a common fact base, the lack of a common narrative of what is or is not important. I have in my hand, I feel like Joseph McCarthy, I have in my hand a list of the top issues for voters, and what is remarkable is how dissimilar they are for Republicans as opposed to Democrats. The only thing that voters on both sides of the aisle seem to agree upon is that they don't like the healthcare system. We can all agree on that. So I'm curious, under a future Trump administration, under a future Harris administration, what steps do you see your candidate taking in order to speak not just to their own party, but speak beyond their party in a way that all Americans can begin to see the world in the same way? And again, I'll start with you, Steve.
It's a great question. You know, I just wrote I write a weekly column, and I wrote my weekly column on the fact that, and this is, you know, I love this great, great country of ours, and I agree with a lot of what you said. And look, America is truly the first and only successful multicultural society in the history of civilization. And we should be very proud of that. Now, do we have work to do? Absolutely, for sure. But immigrants come into this country, they do incredibly well. You know, does anybody know what ethnic group is by far the wealthiest in America today? By far? Asians, people with brown skin. Hispanics are doing incredibly well. The economic advance of Hispanics has been spectacular over the last 25 or 30 or 40 years. Blacks have done better, but not as well as these other ethnic groups. There's something else going on here than just skin color. But I am worried about this because right now I think America is more polarized as a country than we've been culturally, economically, and geographically than we've been arguably since the Civil War. I mean, people are now self-segregating. You know, you're seeing millions and millions of people leaving blue states. You know, that's the big story of America is all these people, the blue states are being bled dry. And where are they coming? Right here to Texas. They're coming to Florida. They're going to Utah. They're going to Montana. California, which was once the golden state, they could lose 3 or 4 congressional seats if this depopulation of California continues. One of the points I should have made at the beginning is, look, let's not make America look like California, right? Because California is a total disaster right now. What's happened in San Francisco and Los Angeles and Oakland, it's heartbreaking what's happened there. And so I'm very worried about that. I'm worried about that there might be, I think there will be violence depending, you know, on November 6th, because regardless of what happens, 49.8% of the American people are going to be really, really, really unhappy, depending on who wins this election. I'll make one other quick point, if I may. Look, you are right. I mean, what you said is right, but let's stick to the facts. The facts are very clear. Black Americans and Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans did incredibly well financially, economically, during the Trump administration. They did. This is just the official, you said make this fact-based. This is just the official Census Bureau data. Black Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans did really well. We had, under Donald Trump, prior to COVID, the lowest Hispanic poverty rate in the history of the United States. We had the lowest Black poverty rate in the history of the United States under Trump. We had the lowest unemployment rate for Black Americans in the history of the United States under Donald Trump. We had the lowest Hispanic unemployment rate in the history of the United States. We had the biggest income gains for Blacks and Hispanics under Donald Trump. Now, do those sound like the policies of a racist president? Really? I mean, let's look at what happened, not what he said. Look, and I'm offended oftentimes by some of the things Donald Trump says too. And I just roll my eyes and I'm embarrassed by it, frankly. But look at the results. Under Harris and Biden, Black families and Hispanic families have lost income. And it really comes down to that.
I'll say in terms of answering the question, I think what President Harris and Walz's administration could do in terms of this divide is a few things. I mean, I think one thing that we've seen, especially the last few years, is the rise of disinformation and misinformation, including from people like Elon Musk, who've definitely shown their true colors and where they stand. They're not libertarians. They're not independents. They're saying they're MAGA, and they're saying this proudly. But they've also, they put up misinformation. Kamala Harris as Mao Zedong, and the young people are clueless because they don't know who Mao was. So all of us here, I'm a Gen Xer. I'm 51, and so many of the voters that they're saying this to, when they're calling her a communist and socialist, things that she's not. She's really a capitalist, and if anything, she's not even on the far left of the Democratic Party. I mean, she's it's a neoliberal economic program. I mean, it is still, from the perspective, and we've got a great historian right by my side, the perspective of people like Roosevelt and Johnson. It's certainly not the great society that she's pushing. She's definitely pushing investments in the middle class, investments in the earned child tax credit, investments in new housing credits to build 3 million new houses. So when we think about domestic policy, to shore up the Affordable Care Act and give people more access to that, lower prescription drugs, do things that really will help revitalize the rural economy. And in fact, what they did under Biden-Harris with the Inflation Reduction Act has really helped red states and red cities, and we've got the data to prove that. So when we think about what she could do, I mean, one of the things that we're lacking right now is a consensus on what does it mean to be an American. But our previous consensus, and this is where you don't want to get rid of the good for the perfect, for your perfect dream. So, of course, anytime we talk about the past, there was racism, sexism, queerphobia, all these different things. But there have been points when you think about the Second World War, the anti-colonial struggles then, when you think about the civil rights movement, when you think about women's rights, where America, broadly speaking, was on the side of good, okay? The moral and the political good. And we've lost our way to the extent that we're not sharing a world view that allows us to have consensus. And consensus is always predicated upon compromise. So consensus means that we don't get the full loaf, okay? So consensus is you're going over to your in-laws and you're saying, hey, I wanted this specific dish. And then you find out the kids are gluten-free. And you're like, damn, gluten-free. I love the bread she makes, right? And it's not that she doesn't make the bread, but she's also making some gluten-free options too, right? And then that's the compromise, right? So you get your bread, but there's a gluten-free option and there's a compromise. The way we're doing policy now in politics in the United States is that everybody wants their own thing and 100% of that thing, right? 100%. And there's no willingness to compromise. So part of what a Harris presidency has to do is really talk to the entire nation, including if she does become president, the 49% that Stephen's saying are going to be very upset, is to do outreach there too. And I think that rhetorically she already has, and I think policy-wise she already has, right? So one of the things we have to understand is that the debate that's happening in America is asymmetrical, because one side right now, and I'm sad that this is the case, is not a pro-multiracial democracy side, right? One side is interested in gerrymandering. It's interested in voter suppression. It's interested in all these things that are anti-democratic, right? And so what we need is, yes, a debate, and you could have people who are saying, hey, I think I remember Jack Kemp Republicans, right? Jack Kemp, where Jack Kemp would say, hey, I want to help the inner city. I want to help black folks. And here's how I think, by being a Republican and tax cuts, this is how it's going to do it. We've gone so far away from that argument, right? Where this is not two different sides who are arguing in good faith with each other, right? So part of what President Harris would have to do is make an argument and a discussion where that's in good faith and not bad faith. And again, I mean, the question that I would ask Stephen is that why do you think people who are rock-ribbed conservatives, good people like Liz Cheney, are supporting Vice President Harris? Why are so many, even people who were formerly in the previous administration before Biden, are supporting Vice President Harris? Like, why would that be the case? So Liz Cheney is not a New York Times liberal, right? And she's supporting, George W. Bush and Laura Bush are not liberals. Why are they supporting Vice President Harris?
I would like to insert a fact check. Liz Cheney is not a New York liberal. Just check. I agree. I'm going to give you a chance to ask him a question in a sec, but how do you answer the question of how is it that people who used to be, let's just say, well ensconced within the Republican Party, are deciding that President Trump is not the man for them?
Look, Trump has clearly changed the Republican Party. There's no doubt about it. The Republican Party, and I think in a very positive way. If you look, I was just looking at this data. If you look at the data from like when Reagan won his two landslide elections in '80 and '84, if you did a plot, and on the left side is the poorest districts in America, and on the right side are the richest districts in America. You follow me? And then it's the percentage of the Republican vote that each income group gave to Reagan. The line goes like this. In other words, the wealthier the district, the more likely it was to vote Republican. And the poorer the district, the more likely it was to vote for the Democrats. That's completely changed. It changed completely in 2016 and 2020. What has happened, and this is why some of you scoffed when I said this, what Donald Trump has done is made Republicans the working class party. And you may scoff at that, but that just shows that just is what the data is showing us. So, for example, the line used to go like this, where the poorer districts voted for the Democrats, and the richest districts voted for Republican. Now it's not like that at all. It goes like this. So the very, very wealthiest districts voted overwhelmingly for Biden and also for Hillary. And the very poorest districts voted for Biden and Hillary. And the middle class, working class areas of the country voted for Trump. That's just a fact. And I think that's a good thing. That's a healthy thing. Republicans are representing now, at least Trump is. Trumpism is about lifting the fortunes of people in the middle. And whether they're white or black or brown or red, whatever, it has become a working class party. Now, another quick point about this. Look, we're going to stick with the facts, so let's stick with the facts. Kamala Harris was in the United States Senate. She was in the United States Senate for 4 years. So she does have a voting record. She has these are facts, folks. You said she's not really that liberal. She had the most liberal voting record of any senator in the entire United States Senate for 4 years. There was no liberal left-wing policy that she was opposed to. And in fact, so much so, this is hard to believe, but it is true, that Kamala Harris had a more liberal voting record than not only Elizabeth Warren. Are you ready for this? She was to the left of Bernie Sanders. Now, how do you do that? You need almost a crowbar to get to the left of Bernie Sanders, but she did. So she is the most left-wing candidate that's ever run for president in American history. Now, maybe Americans want that, but at least they should go into the election with their eyes open.
So I'm going to ask each of you a question about what I think is really the central heart of each of the campaigns that you're describing. And it's helpful that you manage being more radical than Bernie Sanders, because Donald Trump in the last week, I think, and you're the economist, so I have two questions on the economy for you, suggested that we should cap credit card interest rates at 10%.
Totally against that.
And wait, he's against it or I'm against it, or you're against it?
I'm 100% against that. It's the dumbest policy he's ever proposed. We are all against price controls, right? Always, always, always against price controls. Whether it's drug companies, whether it's the credit card companies, whether it's, we're going to really have price controls on grocery stores. Come on, that's something that Kamala Harris has come out with.
Well, so just to complete the point,
policy.
well, it's a dumb policy, and it's Bernie Sanders, just so everybody knows, suggested 15%, and Donald Trump suggested 10.
I know. I'm embarrassed by it. I hate it.
Well,
Trump knows I hate that policy. Look, I don't agree with Trump on everything.
okay, so explain to me again, as an economist, and we're at a university here, so there's lots of economists. One of the main critiques that we hear of the Trump economic policy is it seems to have a different sense of how tariffs work than the traditional sense that one learns in an economics department.
So Trump, I could talk for 20 minutes on this, but I promise I won't. I'll just give a 2-minute answer because we've got a lot of questions to get to. I've talked to Trump many, many times on tariffs. And by the way, we all know the 5 pillars of prosperity, right? Less government spending, a sound currency, less government regulation, free trade. Free trade is really critically important. And those are the building blocks of a strong economy. And so Trump has taken a position that is contrary to what is good for economic growth. But I will say this, Trump, if you want to understand Trump, you have to read his book. You just have to read it. It's called The Art of the Deal, right? And Trump is, in my opinion, one of the great negotiators of all time. I've seen it. I saw it up firsthand. I saw him go to NATO, for example, and say, you countries are going to pay your NATO dues, right? We all agree that NATO countries should pay what they owe us, right? And he went to them and
okay,
said,
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm sorry. They don't owe us.
Well, they owe NATO.
Yeah.
They owe
Okay.
NATO. Well, but we were footing the bill for NATO. And we might have all different opinions about NATO. I'm not a big fan of NATO. But in any case, he said, you're going to pay your NATO dues. They said, hell no, we're not going to. And so Trump said, okay, if you're not going to pay your your NATO dues, we're going to slap you with the 30% tariff. And what do you think they did? The next day they came back and said, oh, okay, we're going to pay our NATO dues. Same thing with China. If you're going to stop stealing from us, you're going to stop engaging in predatory trade practices that destroy American jobs. And China said, no, we're not going to stop. And he said, okay, when he says I'm going to put a 200% tariff on China, who do you think he's talking to? He's talking to President Xi. He's saying, you better, stop acting up, stop robbing us, or we're going to clobber you with tariffs. So what I'm saying is Trump used tariffs very effectively to promote American jobs, American national security interest, and American economic interest. And so, his bark is a lot worse than his bite when it comes to tariffs. I'll put it like that.
I'm going to turn to a critical question that has, I think, plagued, which is not too strong a word, the Harris campaign. And you and I discussed this earlier in the office, so I have a sense of where you're going to go with it, but they didn't. And that is that Vice President Harris has been remarkably reticent in historical terms to sit down for interviews and to sit down for press conferences. In the 56 days after she got the nomination, the Vance-Trump team did, according to NPR, you like NPR, did 9 times as many interviews and press conferences. If Kamala Harris is trying to present herself as a change agent, as a vice president, why do you think she's having difficulty getting that message, making that message, or getting that message distributed?
Well, no, here's where I would say that when you think about what's happened in the last 56 days, and I think this is where there's going to be people who support Vice President Harris's run for president, where they can converge at times with the former president. Legacy media in our country is broken. And I'm going to say that again. Legacy media in the United States of America is broken. And that's all across. That's Fox, that's CNN, and it's broken in different reasons. I think Fox is connected to a right-wing, authoritarian, anti-democratic context and vision of America. But CNN and MSNBC and New York Times and others, legacy media is broken. And by broken, I mean they are not holding the right wing and MAGA and corporations accountable. They do a moral equivalency where you have somebody who's a former president of the United States who will do a press conference and have dozens and dozens of lies that are fact-checked by sometimes NPR, sometimes Pew, and others, but that legacy media just covers like an infomercial, like it's C-SPAN, right? So the reason why the vice president, in my opinion, hasn't sat down with legacy media to their chagrin is that legacy media, the so-called fourth estate, has done a critically damaging role in the evisceration of American democracy. Now, some of that is connected with the political class and the end of the fairness doctrine, the end of the equal time rule that we all grew up with. I'm 51. I remember ABC School of Rock. I remember I'm Just a Bill, right? I remember the way in which we used to watch not just PBS NewsHour, but you would have equal time. You'd have a right wing and a left speaker, right, on at the same time. So it's not that, to me, Vice President Harris is running away from the legacy media. I think she realized that in a lot of ways, if she actually wanted to speak to the American people, she had to get beyond the legacy media. And I think that one of the former president's achievements in 2016 was doing that and reaching this group of people who, even as I vehemently and virulently disagree with the message he gave them, but he was reaching beyond the legacy media for those people. Even though the former president, unlike Vice President Harris, he still receives, and they've done data on this, hundreds of millions of dollars in free publicity because his press conferences and stuff are just recorded like an infomercial by CNN and MSNBC. And this is unprecedented because he is lying and he's saying factually incorrect things besides offending people, and they're still just covering it, right? So you can't ask the vice president then to sit down and do all these appearances when this same media, which refuses to hold J.D. Vance accountable, refuses to hold the former president accountable, is now trying to grill her. It's asymmetrical warfare that we're involved in right here. And I give her and her people credit for that realization.
Let me ask both of you this question, because the same question, I mean. I think, as you said, Donald Trump often, his bark is different than his bite. He often says things that are a little bit off the cuff, shall we say, a little bit off color, perhaps. By the same token, I watched the last debate. Vice President Harris said some things that were inaccurate as well. how do you think that the American people should learn to listen to candidates whom the first thing we do for both sides, for both major candidates, is go to our preferred media source for fact-checking?
Well, let's do a poll here. How many of you actually think that the American media is too conservative? Raise your hand. I mean, come on, really. I mean, the fact is, Trump, the media hates Trump. They hate Trump. And actually, you're right. They do fall for Trump. Is an incredible marketer, and you're exactly right. What he does is, I remember like when I was working on the campaign in 2016, he would like throw little. He was like throwing little crumbs behind him. The media, blah, 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 blah. They just couldn't get enough of Trump, and so he would say the most outrageous things, sometimes crazy things that are offensive. But he did that because look at from the time Donald Trump announced he was running for president in 2016 to the day he won, he was on the front page of every single newspaper every single day.
The 2015 when he announced.
Yeah, it really started. Yeah. So, I mean, he even though the media hates him, he is pretty good at manipulating it. I think the answer to your question, how do people figure out what's true and what's not true? You have to, you can't think just because something's said in the New York Times or said on Fox News or said on CNN that it's true. You just can't. The media lies all the time. I mean, let's not forget, Donald Trump was the victim of one of the greatest lies in American history, and it almost cost him his presidency. And you know what I'm talking about. The Russia collusion story, which was a complete lie. It was completely made up, and the Democrats tried to impeach him on the basis of an incredible lie.
But there were so many things that weren't made up in terms of the sexual assault and harassment charges and the 34 indictments. So there's been so many different...
But they did try to impeach Trump. Talk about a danger to democracy. The Democrats tried to impeach Trump on the basis of a complete lie. That's pretty dangerous to democracy.
And again, there's going to be people who disagree with you in terms of on the Putin.
Russian collusion?
Well, not Russian collusion, maybe, but on Putin and what the relationship with Putin has been.
That's why they tried to impeach him now.
And one thing I'll say about media, I think that it's a wrong question to ask whether people in this room believe media is conservative. I would say that what's so interesting about the former president's impact on media over the last decade, because he also has a 3-decade history before that, and I'm a native New Yorker, so I remember that, and the Central Park Five, and all this dishonorable and disgraceful and racist things that the former president was connected to. 5 who were innocent, who were exonerated from the crime, said they should have death penalty, all these different things. But what the former president has done, the impact on legacy media, is that he has distorted legacy media's ability to frame existential questions about our democracy and our lives, including the New York Times. It's not just everybody. So what he did is transform. He's a paradigm shifter when it comes to media. And that's why, in so many ways, Vice President Harris moving away from that media makes sense, because what he did, and you're exactly right, Stephen, when you said he's leaving little crumbs, and you even said it, he's a master at manipulating them. And I agree with you. You said that they hate him, but I think it's a small H hate, because remember when Jeff Zucker was at CNN, and he said that, Donald Trump, people may dislike him, but he's making us a fortune, and the ratings are so good, right? He was saying he might be bad for America, but he's good for CNN, right? So that's different from a kind of patriotic capitalism that we've had in the past, where you wanted to make money, but you were saying you wanted it to be good for America, right? You wanted to be wealthy, but you wanted it to be good for America. So when we think about his impact on the media, it's incredible, and it continues to this day. They don't know what's up or down or left and right and black or white anymore. Not at all. And nor do they care. They've completely lost not just a moral compass, but any kind of ethical compass, any kind of knowing what is right or wrong, right? And I would say absolutely the only reason why he's a viable candidate right now is because he's so disrupted the way in which people receive and perceive information that, anything goes, right? So he's normalized these things that should have never been normalized, right? And so she's left to trying to speak and articulate her message beyond a mediascape that, you're right, maybe in 2008 for Obama, they were in the tank for him, but for her, not at all, because the former president has upset. It's a paradigm shift that we're still going to have to see after this election. Do we have a fourth estate that's even, and I have 3 children. My youngest ones, they don't listen to the legacy media. They're getting this stuff from each other, and they don't listen to any of this stuff. They don't listen to Wall Street Journal, New York Times, 15, 16 years old, right? So we're going to need a new way to get information. You know,
I think we all agree that the media is corrupt and just distorts the news, and that's a really big
I
thing.
actually don't think the media is corrupt, but that's just me. No, I don't. I think they're actually trying to do a very difficult job.
I think there's a difference between local media and in huge corporate media.
So unfortunately, we are nearing the end of the time that's been allotted. And I want to tell you why we're nearing the end of the time that's been allotted. It's not just because your time is valuable. It's also because we have partnered for this project with the McGuire Center for Ethics, where there is going to be a workshop for students that begins immediately after this, run by Professor Jill DeTemple, so that students who have come to this event, having witnessed civil discourse, can learn how to practice civil discourse. And I want to make sure that they stay on time. But I do have one more question, and I'm going to ask you, I'm going to do the whole moderator thing and ask you to limit your remarks to 60 seconds for time. What you have both done is convinced me that I should vote for Franklin Roosevelt. And the reason is you're both articulating aspects of his 4 freedoms, but different aspects. I think if I were to sum up your remarks, it would be that what a president really needs to focus on is freedom from want, to make sure that there is prosperity which will produce other goods for America. What you're describing is a president really needs to work on freedom from fear, that Americans need to feel included. 1 minute, here's the question, convince each other. Why are economics matter more, and why do values matter more?
Yeah, sure. I would say
I think you lost your...
Okay, yeah. I'd say in a nutshell, values, if we're going to define it that way, and this idea of dignity, it's the whole ball game. And I think that's the secret sauce of America, that at its best, it's a country where people engage with each other and their fellow, not just citizens, but their fellow country women and men, based around this idea of human dignity and moral dignity in a way that is inclusive of religion, race, identity, the whole ball game. So the only way to have America as that Reagan called it a city, a shining city on the hill, right? That beacon, is to think about dignity and to think about freedom from anything that makes us look upon each other as less than valuable human beings.
Thank you. Steve?
That's a good answer. So I would say that, well, one of the reasons I focus on economics is, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so I look at the world through the economy, but obviously all these other issues matter a whole lot. But it's also true that, the polls have been pretty consistent, that the number one issue for the American people is the economy, and the second issue for the American people is immigration. So, those are just, that hasn't changed much over the last year and a half. I make one last point. One of the things I'm most proud of that Trump has proposed that we didn't even talk about is, and this gets to the whole issue of race, is Trump wants to have, and it's first time in any major political party in the history of the United States, the Republican platform under Trump says every single child in America should have access to the best schools. And you talked about what happened, the disgrace of what was happening in the South when the white Southerners would not allow black kids to go to the best schools. Now we have a situation, frankly, where it's the opposite. It's the liberals who are, we want to give $10,000 vouchers to every single black child and Hispanic child to go to the best school they can, private, Catholic, Jewish school, whatever. And it's the teachers' unions and the Democrats who are opposing that and forcing our minority kids with the lowest income to go to the absolute worst schools.
Okay.
Shouldn't we all agree?
May
every kid
I
should be
think
able to go
I'm going
great
to I'm going to
school?
do another I'm going to do another
Kids should not be able to go to great schools.
well, sir, this we're civil here.
You're not for kids going to great schools?
Don't respond.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So, 2 points. The first is I'm going to fact check something really, really, really important, which is actually a fact check from our good friend Lynn Minna, who reminded me before I came on stage that if you're going to register, if you have not yet registered in Texas, you have to put your registration in the mail before October 7th.
But you have to be a citizen.
True. That is true. Though non-citizens may use the postal service. for other
We
things.
have like such small even attempts at voter fraud historically. You have to go back to the 19th century and Tammany, especially for
debate for another hour.
a country where 175 million people are going to vote on November 5th. People do not try to fraudulently vote in our country, which is why every single state should have same-day voter registration. Only 20 have. High school seniors should be registered to vote. And we really should have uniform voting for federal elections. So every 2 and 4 years are the only time we all vote together for congressional and then for Senate and president, right? And we should have uniform voting regulations.
And we should have voter ID so that we know that everybody is actually a citizen.
Well, I disagree with you there because voter ID, there's so many people unless you said all these things could be considered IDs, including college IDs and all. So Texas will take your gun license ID, but not a University of Texas at Austin ID, right? And so that is unfair. And I think anybody who's objective would know that that is unfair, right?
We could just keep going on and on.
I know,
all
but
night.
they'll get us. I have to point
I've had a lot of fun tonight. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
as a
Thank you.
former Texas A&M Aggie, I have to say I would not accept a University of Texas ID. But in any event,
Hook 'em, everyone.
one more point. Put your fingers down. One more point, if I may.
Have you had more of a
These
rambunctious
questions,
debate than this?
yes,
You have.
these questions have been excellent, and we're going to actually take the opportunity of putting your questions up on our website. So you can see, we didn't have nearly enough time to get to them. Sorry, Brian, I just gave you some work. And we're going to make sure that you have the opportunity to see what your fellow Americans wanted if we had had infinite time for me to ask. With that, I want to thank you all for coming, and please join us next month, and please join
Thank you.
me in thanking our guests.